hitting our gut. But the microbiome is a huge number of microbes. It's in the trillions, something like 30, 40, 50 trillion, which is kind of like about as many stars as there are up there that we see in the sky. Like it's really a lot of cells of these microbes in our gut. There's more cells of them about, some people say it's 10 times, some people say it's 100 times more of those cells than our cells. You know, so there's just a massive amount of bacteria that are living mostly in our gut, some of them on our skin, up the nose, pretty much in all our orifices. So they're part of our journey through life. We get some from our mothers when we're born, not so many if you have a C-section birth because it's different. And so the children who are C-section tend to have a weaker, not so healthy microbiome, sets them up for some things like allergies and so on. But, you know, we get our bacteria anyway from the environment. You'll find as I go through tonight, especially when I get to the reports, that, I mean, the main problem that I'm wanting you to figure out tonight is whether you have enough of an imbalance of your microbiome to be causing you some symptoms. The first part of my talk, though, I'll be giving you more as just a general idea of the good things they do for us. And also I'll be talking about how you can improve your own microbiome without, you know, anything more than just working with your diet, maybe probiotics. So that'll be the sort of personally empowering part of what I'll talk about tonight. And then I'll go on to, just in case some of you need to do tests like the ones you have in your hands, just to give you an idea of how that works and what you could find out through testing of the microbiome. All right, does that sort of sound like what you're here for? Okay, good. Well, a good start there. So let's see if it does work. Yay. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking a bit about, come on through, grab yourself a seat. I'll be talking about the gut microbiome and its influences on your health. There's a ton of influences. Sebastian just asked me about mental health, and we'll talk about other areas that get affected by your microbiome as well. And then I'll be also talking about the value of doing the tests, so as you understand why, when you might be bothering to spend some money on that sort of thing. So this slide is just showing some of the main things. I know it's a bit of a technical looking slide, but on the next part, I'll be breaking it into something that you can understand more easily. But the microbiome here is being represented by, does that button work for that? No, okay. At the top there, you can see what's representing the colon and the digestive organs. It's not showing the stomach, that slide, but what is showing in the middle of that, all that gooey, spirally sausagey looking thing, that's the small intestine, which is around this area. And then surrounding that, your small intestine's empty on that side, and then it comes up to the, what they call ascending colon, and it switches over, and then goes down to where you poop. So that's your intestines. So there's a small intestine and a large intestine. Sometimes the large intestine is called the colon or the bowel. So, and that's the large intestine is the one that an endocrinologist can look up with a tube and call it a colonoscopy. Another name for the large intestine is the colon. So those are all interchangeable names. But when you have a poke down with a doctor looking at your stomach, you get to the very first organ up here, but you don't get to the small intestine. When you go in the backside, you get into the colon, but you don't get into the small intestine. So very often there's an underdiagnosis of problems when it's happening in the small intestine. And then, of course, there's digestive organs around that too that are not always easy to assess. But the microbiome that's living, most of the numbers of the microbiome should be in your colon and shouldn't be very much in your small intestine, because the small intestine is where you digest stuff. It's where you absorb nutrients and so on. And if there's bacteria living in there, the toxins that they produce also get absorbed, and they produce more effects. You feel sicker if you have a disturbance to the microbiome in your small intestine. In your large intestine, the air is not so much made to absorb stuff, it's made to excrete stuff. Mainly your large intestine just pulls water out of the food. But there's a lot of fermentation goes on in your large intestine, and that's where most of the microbiome is living, especially if you're eating enough fiber to feed them. And if you're not eating enough fiber to feed them, they're not doing their work. And many of the things that they're doing are good for us when you have the right microbiome. So one of the things I'll be emphasizing tonight is just to be making sure you eat plenty of fiber. Most people in Hong Kong eat 1 serve of vegetables a day instead of 4 or 5. And that makes a huge difference to how much food you're giving the microbiome. Also, if you tend to eat refined carbohydrates, they don't have much fiber in them. And so all these things about how much fiber in your diet has a huge effect on whether you have enough food in your gut to feed the microbiome. So on the slide there's sort of 3 main color arrows, the black, blue one, the green one, and the red one. I'll just mention what those 3 things are doing. The first one in the blue side is the metabolic functions, and I'll talk about those on the next slide. The next kind of thing that the microbiome does is affects your immunity a lot, both getting rid of or preventing infections like viruses, as well as what they call modulating your immunity, so it doesn't get too crazy with things like psoriasis or other what are called autoimmune diseases. So it keeps it in a balance, and that's what the word modulation means. Hi there. Never mind. Only a few minutes, really. Okay, and then the third factor that's under the red arrow is the microbiome also affects our vitamin production, especially the B vitamins, but also vitamin K. So it also influences how much of the nutrients get into our system. The microbiome has actually probiotics play a big role in how much of actually the food, the nutrients we absorb. So different microbes can actually help us with, like, I could give you a probiotic that helps you absorb protein, for instance, or the lactobacillus types of probiotics. They tend to help you to manage sugars. Some people, when they eat fruit, they find they get gas and bloated, but if they eat the probiotics help them to digest the fruit sugar. Or the sugar in milk also, oftentimes if you use extra probiotics, it can help you to digest the lactose that's in milk that a lot of people have trouble to digest. Like most Asians have a bit of trouble with digesting lactose because you don't have the enzymes for it. But if you have enough of the probiotics that help you digest them, then you can digest the lactose and you don't have so many symptoms from a lactose intolerance. Does that make sense so far? So probiotics do help you to digest. They also help your immunity and they help your metabolism. And I'll go into that now. Are these guys wanting to see Alice, or is it something else? So, okay. So I'll go on to the next slide. So I'm just breaking those 3 or 4 main things down into a little bit more explanation. When we say metabolic functions, it's really to do with how whether your sugar balance works, whether you're accumulating a lot of fat in your body. The metabolic functions include things like whether you have high cholesterol and diabetes and something called a fatty liver. Quite a common problem that the fats accumulate. If you're getting too sugary, too much obesity on your tummy, it tends to be your liver also gets involved as a fatty liver, which is when things start to go downhill, because then you start to get blocked in your arteries and get the heart diseases and so on. Now, all of those are accelerated by having the wrong microbiome. Yeah, so that's one of the kind of things that happens with microbiome. The other one I sort of talked about in the last slide mentioned the immunomodulation. It means balancing your immune system. So that here's an example of the benefits you get with having the right microbes in your gut. People who take probiotics, and families, children, adults, doesn't matter what age, they get roughly half the amount of colds and flus and fevers and so on in any 1 year. So half the number of days off school, half a number of days off work, whether it's office workers or factory workers or kids at school, just by taking a probiotic every day. So, but that's a well-established study by a group called Cochrane. They look at all the studies of the studies and they mass it up into a statistic. And it was almost 50% reduction in the number of infections you get each year if you have a good microbiome. So it's a big influence on our immunity. You know, I often have parents coming and saying, well, how can I help my kid who keeps on getting sick? And I basically make sure they get onto a probiotic and take some vitamin D. And they usually get their number of infections each year going down from about 6 or 7 down to 1 or 2. You know, it makes it that much difference. And then I mentioned the vitamin business. There's another kind of quirky thing you were asking about mental health and the gut. And one of the things that probiotics do is they make some of the neurotransmitters. So why we call them neurotransmitters, and we think they're made in the brain, actually a tremendous amount of the neurotransmitters are made in the gut, and they can be absorbed and used by the brain. So there are nutrients that the gut makes because of the microbiome. And if it's disturbed, then you start to get these things going wrong. Does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah. Anything at all? All right, just keep it going. So what do you do to help yourself get a better microbiome? Basically, it comes down to having a plant-based diet. It doesn't mean being vegetarian or vegan. All it means is that the bulk of your food is coming from plants. Not so much from meats. In some cases, people consume the protein. And not so much from refined carbohydrates, so that white bread, white rice, and so on. They don't feed the microbiome very well. So one of the reasons we like to encourage whole foods is because the fiber in the grains, things like oats, for instance, as a breakfast, their fiber left over feeds the bacteria, feeds the microbiome in the colon, which is where most of that good work is being done by these bacteria. So what this slide is showing is kind of like the good side and the bad side. You can kind of see the one on the right, things like donuts and fatty foods and just fast foods and junk, and not any fruit and vegetables. Whereas on the other side, the fruit and vegetables, the fiber, the fermented foods is also, you can't see that slide too well, can you? But fermented foods are also listed there. Fermented foods include things like yogurt or kimchi or kefir. So fermented foods, even pickled foods, if not from a can, but it's more like a living pickled food. Or another example is like kimchi, the Europeans like to make sauerkraut. So all of those foods are fermented. That means they've got live bacteria in them, and those tend to promote the microbiome really well. So it's really useful to find yourself one of those foods that you like. I did. So as you include that in your diet, one of the really easy ones is kimchi. It has a really good effect on the gut, and you can pretty much get it at any supermarkets. You know, most easy one to get here. Not everybody likes to eat dairy products. They're not always good for people. So the yogurt kefir thing is a bit more optional. But fermented cabbage foods really work very well to help build up the microbiome. Okay, so just kind of moving this theme on a little bit. One of the microbiome researchers in the UK made his son, or enrolled his son, into eating Big Macs every day for 10 days. Okay, by about the 4th day, the kid was feeling so sick he wanted to stop, but this was science, so that made him fulfill his 10-day contract. But what happened in that period is that the microbiome in his gut declined, the diversity, the number of kinds of bacteria in his gut declined by 40% in just 10 days. Just to give you an idea of, junk food diets actually affect that off very quickly. It's not like a slow process. The opposite is true too. I didn't put the opposite slide in, which is actually the same researcher tested his gut microbiome when he went to Africa and started eating a really high fiber diet like tribal people. And, it was the opposite side of chart. It just went way up all of a sudden once you get a really high fiber diet. So killing your microbiome is easy. A couple of ways you may not be aware of. A couple of ways you may not be aware of is artificial sugars to it. So sucralose, or the one that's in the chewing gums that kill the microbiome in your mouth. It's usually sorbitol. Most of the sugars in the NOL, sorbitol, mannitol, these are artificial sugars you can find in foods. They actually ruin your good bacteria levels quite substantially. And the other kind of junk food thing is if you're eating that sort of high-fat type of diet that comes with fast foods, and also a keto diet, by the way, I've got a lot of keto people coming in, well, not a lot, but I have keto people coming through. And basically, it's a high-fat diet. They don't necessarily have very many vegetables where there's lots of protein, and they don't eat grains at all. So we've got a real lack of fiber and a high-fat content. And that disturbs the microbiome a lot. They don't have a healthy microbiome at all, which will have its consequences as they go along. So what am I saying? It's easy to ruin your microbiome with a junk food diet and with artificial sugars and so on. Of course, antibiotics, they reduce our microbiome levels by about a factor of like 1,000. So we normally have trillions, but it takes it back to hundreds of millions, which is a big change. So antibiotics take some time to recover from, and they can change the microbiome for many, many months and sometimes years. So the antibiotic problem is quite substantial, changing the kind of bacteria in your gut too, because you're left over with the ones that are antibiotic resistant, which can create its own set of problems. Quite a lot. A lot of times when we're treating them naturally, we've only got 1 or 2 herbs out of and no antibiotics that treat the the bacteria that are there after antibiotics. It's like the bacterial resistance in the microbiome is quite disturbing actually. But another thing that ruins your microbiome is emulsifiers. You may not know what emulsifiers are, but it's like if you buy a salad dressing in a supermarket, it tries to mix the oil and the liquid, by putting in emulsifiers. So it's already blended kind of thing. Emulsifiers are in things like mustards and so on to try and mix up all of the fats and the liquid content so it blends well. The emulsifiers ruin your good bacteria. So if you would start to notice whether there are emulsifiers in your products, it'd be good to reduce those. Preservatives, they're often found in foods, so particularly cold meats like salamis and so on, they have preservatives in them. A preservative is made to kill bacteria. It's made to keep the meat from getting infected, you could say. And so preservatives also ruin your microbiome, fairly obviously. So on the opposite side of things, fiber goes the opposite way. And one of the books that you can pick up if you wish to kind of work out a high fiber diet and sequence it in is called Fiber Fueled, and you can easily get that one if you wish to. Now, you're asking about the gut-brain balance. The gut has a tremendously rich nervous system in it by itself. So there's a lot of nerves going through our gastric and intestinal systems. And one of the interesting things is there's also a major nerve called the vagus nerve, which comes out of the gut area and goes into their brain. And the interesting thing about that nerve is there's more messages coming from the gut to the brain than there is the brain to the gut. Meaning it's not so much in this case that the brain's controlling the gut, but in very often times it's the opposite way around. That the way the brain is operating is affected by what's going on in the gut. And so nerve messages from a disturbed gut also tend to irritate the brain over time. So people become irritable or lose their good sleep. And there's another kind of thing. So that's represented by the lines going up and down in the center area of that diagram. That problems from the gut go up and affect the brain. But there's another kind of way that the gut issues affect the brain, and this is more common, which is when you have bacterial overgrowth in your gut. And I'll go into that some more in a bit, whether it's in your stomach or your small intestine or your colon. Many of the bacteria that are in there, parasites too, produce certain toxins. So the toxins themselves can make you very foggy in how you think, particularly toxins coming from yeast make you very foggy-headed. And about 10% of you, so there's a couple of you in here as an average group, would have Candida, a common yeast. So if a couple of you here have a lot of foggy brain problems, it can be the toxin that comes from Candida, a yeast that's fogging up your brain. It's a bit like alcohol has an effect on your brain. And alcohol, it's made from yeasts. And there are other toxins that yeasts can make that also have an effect on your brain. The bacteria, they tend to produce, I'll use a term that's easy to understand called endotoxins. Endo means inside and toxins, but they produce a lot of inflammation, the endotoxins, in your gut, in your liver, and eventually, as the liver can't manage it, go out to affect your brain. Now, when you have a lot of inflammation in any of the organs, they gradually start to get sick. So basically, inflammation is a part of getting old too quick, getting pain too much, and starting to get dysfunctions like joint problems or skin problems, or even in the brain, what it tends to cause is depression. When your brain's hot, like what happens in a mild fever, what do? You don't function too well. It's the same kind of thing is going on when you have a low-grade bacterial infection in your gut. You're tired, you wake a bit, brain goes foggy, and you feel more depressed. So it depends on the degree of the gut problem, is how many of those symptoms come up. But the most common ones I see are mood changes like depression and fatigue, poor sleep, irritability. So, they're fairly common things that people have, and they also might have digestive problems. And we usually find when we treat that part, the mood and the mind symptoms go away. So it's very true that the gut and the brain are very interactive. Does anybody want to ask me around that? Any questions? No? Okay. So what percentage of us have an imbalance in our gut flora? So we've got a group of, let's say we've got 20 for a round number. It's not quite that many, but just for a round number. So, and there's some online actually. So let's say there's 20 of us. So 20% of us will have parasites. That would mean 4 out of the 20 of you would have parasites. So in this room, there'll be about 4 people within the group, about 4 people that have parasites that are creating symptoms. About the same number of people that have constipation, not going to the toilet regularly enough, or straining when they go, not quite cleaning the bowel properly when they go, so stuff staying behind. When that happens, the bacterial levels build up because not getting cleared fast enough. Often it will cause quite a lot of skin issues. Irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, most people know it as. It's pretty common. About 10% of people have it. Some forms of it cause diarrhea. Some forms of it cause sluggish bowels, and some go between the two. The poor people who have the diarrhea form, they can't really control the bowels properly. Can you imagine traveling around Hong Kong and not knowing when you're going to have it, to need to go to the toilet? It's like, where are the toilets? And go to many MTR stations before there's a toilet in one of them. It creates a lot of anxiety. And the trouble with IBS is it's this two-way thing, that the gut itself is creating a bunch of symptoms that tends to make you anxious. And then the condition makes you anxious because you're not able to control the bowels too well. And then you don't know what to eat because you think that food is causing. However, most of the times people have IBS, it's actually a bacterial overgrowth in their gut, and it's not that much caused by the foods. So, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, fairly common, and certainly in medical practices, we see a lot of people with it because it's poorly treated. Nobody until about 5 or 6 years ago realized that IBS was caused by bacteria in the small intestine. And that condition I'll talk about, on the next slide. But about 10% of us I mentioned earlier have Candida, the yeast infection. That's the one that tends to be foggy, create a lot of fogginess in your brain. There's a shorthand way of saying small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So if you have an overgrowth of bacteria in that chunk that's around your navel area, that's where you'll have your small intestine. What it usually appears as is some kind of pain or discomfort, or certainly a lot of bloating, something swelling up around the central area. And it causes a bunch of other symptoms because there's SIBO, or the shorthand for small intestine bacterial overgrowth is SIBO. Because the toxins that absorb get very easily absorbed from the small intestine, because it's designed to absorb the nutrients from your food. It's the area that has those microvilli, little extensions within your stomach. And it makes the surface area of the small intestine about the same as the surface area of this floor. They say it's about equal to a tennis court. the absorption area inside of your small intestine. The small intestine is about 20 feet long, and it has all of these little like cilia, little projections that makes the surface area very high. So when there's bacterial toxins in there, they get absorbed and they create the inflammation. And basically, wherever you're weak in your body, whether it's your brain or your joints or your skin, you'll get inflammation-related symptoms, which are different for each of the organs. Pain in your joints, it's foggy or depressed in your brain, your skin, acne and eczema and psoriasis and all sorts of fairly chronic conditions of the skin. So SIBO has a big effect on general health. Yeah. Then other symptoms that are common in the gut that are, many of you might have in the room, again, dyspepsia, maybe five or six people in a group of 20 would have some kind of feeling in this area, higher up. And the dyspepsia is like this zone, your stomach zone. And sometimes it's caused by too much acid, and sometimes it's caused by too little acid. It's actually sometimes hard to pick which one it is. Most people who go along to a doctor with dyspepsia get proton pump inhibitors. That means things that block your stomach acid production, which is really a bad idea because all of the food you eat has some bacteria, and there's bacteria in your mouth too. So every bite you swallow has some bacteria in it. And if your stomach acid is missing, well, those bacteria go to the next place. Yeah. And that's when you're more prone to pick up something like the SIBO, the small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So keeping your stomach function in good shape, really important. As people get older, their stomach function tends to get weaker and not make enough acid. And so they're more prone to getting these bacterial overgrowths. And oftentimes the under-acidity problem is more than 20% of older people. They just don't have enough acid to digest their food. And so the bacteria levels build up. So it's pretty common for them. This is all the bad part of the talk, by the way. This is like, okay, lots of times there's people with digestive problems. It's a really common issue. That's what I'm trying to get across for you. And then there's just like digestive organs themselves, like the stomach, or the next one past there's called the pancreas. And the pancreas is secreting a lot of enzymes that digest your food, should be. And it can get lazy or insufficient in its function. When you have a lot of bacterial overgrowth, it tends to make it get weak because the inflammation affects it. So there's a bit of a crisscross that if you have stomach infections or small intestine infections, then the digestive organs also go weak because of the inflammation. So it tends to then get into a positive feedback. The stomach gets weak, you're not making enough acid, and there's more bacteria. But if your pancreas gets weak, you're not digesting your food very well, so there's more food to feed them. So these kind of things start to cause a knock-on effect. Any questions so far? I've said a lot of stuff, it's condensation of a lot of material. I don't expect you to take it all in, but all I'm getting at is, yeah.
So you mentioned that IBS most often not food related, but bacteria related.
Right.
So then why do certain foods trigger IBS?
So they do, and especially some of the sugars, like lactose is an example, or fructose for some people. Once you start to get these bacterial imbalances in your gut, I haven't yet talked about it, but there's a thing called leaky gut.
What?
A leaky gut. So a leaky gut isn't like stuff comes out the back end. It goes this way, that the membrane that's going all the way from your mouth to your anus, it's not very thick, but like 1 cell thick, which is nothing. So it's not like a huge barrier, and it can easily be damaged by bacterial overgrowth. And there's a few other things too, like high stress and so on. But once you've got the bacterial overgrowth in there, then you start to lose the barrier function, and we call it a leaky gut. So what's going on then is that parts of foods like gluten and casein can easily enter into the bloodstream side. And then the immunity goes, oh, that shouldn't be here. And then there's a reaction going on. So often it's a chain of events. You usually the sequence of things goes, people are too stressed by life or whatever goes on in a particular phase of life. That always will affect you, whatever. And digestion, as you know, gets affected by stress. And the immunity in the gut gets weaker. And there's lots of other reasons why the immunity in the gut might be weaker, lack of good bacteria, lack of vitamin D, those sorts of things. But once the digestion power is gone and there's bacterial overgrowth, then things speed up. because the digestion gets weaker just from that. And then you get this leaky gut. And then there's often you can't digest your food properly and get food intolerances on top. So it's often a chain of events that go like that. So yeah, it's not true that if you have IBS, you don't have food intolerances. But usually, like in statistical terms, more often IBS is caused by bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine.
We've got a question from one of our Zoom participants, and it's Angela. And my twin sister suffers from SIBO. Her diet's not that good for many years. Does drinking apple cider every day help?
A bit. So apple cider vinegar is an acid. And most people, when they start to get more chronic with their digestive problems, most of the folks who get more chronic with their digestive problems, the stomach acids start to drop away. And like I said earlier, when you do get enough acid in your stomach area, and the acid can go through to the small intestine too from apple cider vinegar, it tends to improve most people, especially people with chronic problems. It tends to improve their digestion. So it's one of the home cures for poor digestion. Older people do well with it because they often don't have enough stomach acid. So they take a bit of cider vinegar, sometimes mixed with honey to make it like more palatable, with their foods. And gee, I hear a lot of people come in here and say, I do really well on cider vinegar. It's commonly helpful. Okay.
Right. Quick question. Is there a direct way of measuring the level of acid in the stomach?
It's actually quite hard. Yeah, there is a tool for it. There's one of them in Hong Kong that Professor Gartz, but so it's rather hard to get it tested as in with an instrument. But there's a way of kind of determining it for yourself. There's an enzyme product you can buy in the marketplace called betaine HCl. HCl stands for hydrochloric acid, and it's in a pill. So it's not a liquid acid, it's bound up to something that makes it a powder. You take one of those, and if you start to digest a bit better, maybe that's good for me. Take two, better still. Three, but if you might take 2 or 3 and you've got plenty of acid, you might feel that that's burning you, like acid dyspepsia. But the more of those betaine HCLs you need, the weaker your stomach acids are. So quite often, older folks might need 2 or 3 with their foods, especially a protein meal. Yeah, so that's a test, and it's pretty cheap because a bottle of that's like maybe 150 or so. Pretty cheap way to tell. So I'll just go on to the next slide. Let's see what we got there. How does the gut affect you when it's sick? So we've mentioned the gut brain. I haven't yet mentioned about the skin, except in say eczema and psoriasis. But very commonly people get a thing called acne rosacea. It's a kind of it's not like juvenile acne, which is greasy skin and big pock marks, but it's like spots, many of them over the cheeks area. And it's quite common. And pretty well always caused by either something called H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori. I'll talk about this Helicobacter later, because the chart I've given you is about Helicobacter, just because it's pretty common. When you get Helicobacter or SIBO, basically these toxins go somewhere, and very often they show up as acne rosacea. That's one of the problems with the skin. But it can be that gut biology affects your eczema or your psoriasis. So, many of the skin conditions caused by it. You can see this list. It's going to be a bit boring if I go through each one. But I will mention number 6, that oftentimes people feel weaker in their muscles and joints, and they experience that as fatigue when they have these toxins in their system. I've mentioned briefly that you can get a fatty liver. There's a fancy name of something called hepatic encephalopathy, which is when your liver's sick enough that you start to get pretty crazy in your brain. And the gut biology is a big part of how that happens. We know that if you treat the microbiome, the encephalopathy gets better. So that's a very direct kind of liver-related things. It happens with alcoholics. The heart, sometimes some cancers, the thyroid's quite affected, the gland here that sets your metabolism rate, whether you're hot or cold. And then the sex hormones, periods, fertility, especially women, even just heavy, nasty, painful periods, endometriosis, some of those kinds of things always respond well when you get the gut biology better. So basically every organ, right? There's not much missing there. So people can be sick with anything and find their gut gets, when they get the gut better, they improve their health. So the microbiome has been found to cause obesity. We found it in both rats and mice and humans. So firstly, it was discovered in mice. That you had a fat mouse and a skinny mouse, and you got some of the poop from the fat mouse and got it into the skinny mouse. The skinny mouse could turn fat. They were both eating the same chow all the time. So the microbiome affects how much nutrients you get from your food. So if it's a little like 5% more nutrients out of your meal each and every day, then it adds up to cause obesity. And so we know that the microbiome affects that. And there are some probiotics people are using now that have the opposite effect, that help to reduce the risk of diabetes and blood sugar problems. So when it comes around to being a bit more positive about things to improve your gut flora, basically there's a rule being discovered by researching across 40 different countries. At about the time when you get to 30 different, keyword, plant foods a week, your microbiome in your gut is very, very likely to be flourishing, diverse, and healthy. Like it'd be like a diverse, rich, strong ecosystem, like a forest or a rainforest or something, as compared to, like a bare, half desert type of environment. And so what I'm saying is that we in nature, when you have a more diverse microbiome or diverse number of species in a place, things tend to be more stable. Go through changes and not get sick, if you like. But the more we simplify the ecosystem and make things into monocultures, like we do with agriculture now, is the environment becomes much less stable and unhealthy with that. So here's a few foods that you might want to focus on, just listed up there. That colour fruit and veg make a big difference. They're colourings in fruits and veg. They are able to feed the probiotics. So things like blueberries, pomegranates, anything with that sort of darkish kind of colour makes a good difference to feeding the good guys. Happens with green tea or tea in general, not so much the sort of bold ale or the very black teas, but milder teas like the European Earl Grey or around this area oolong tea. That's just like not dark, not green. Many people who are a bit sick find the green tea makes them too cold and don't like it, but it also feeds the microbiome. So does coffee, because it has this stuff in it called polyphenols, and polyphenols feed the good bacteria. So one of the reasons that you want to have quite a diverse diet is to get more of these kind of foods into you. Dark chocolate, how about that? That's a positive. Yeah. So what often happens, so this is not the one you have in your hands, but this is an example of what I see with people when they don't have enough fiber in their diet. I think I'll go around and just point it on that side because I don't have my pointer working. So all of these are different probiotics or good things that should be living in your bowel. Sorry, you can't read it so well. But the idea is when you see these very, very low levels, it means that there's a lack of good bacteria in your gut. These ones here are the ones that should be most numerous. Thank you, better. Oh, it's a little one. I thought it's the other one. Thanks for that, guys. So these ones here are the most numerous, and if they're missing, well, you just don't have enough microbiome to be healthy in the gut. So when I see a patient with this type of report as part of their issues, most of the rest of the things that go wrong because they don't have enough good bacteria in their gut. It starts to allow the bad bacteria to develop. It starts to cause a lot of inflammation. To get technical, just for a moment, some of you know a little bit of stuff. So these ones here produce a lot of what's called butyrate. Butyrate is an anti-inflammatory nutrient that feeds the healthy cells in your gut lining. If you don't have enough butyrate, you're much more likely to develop bowel cancer, for instance. So some bacteria produce it, but they need fiber to do it. So if this whole fiber question keeps on coming up, most of us don't have enough fruit and vegetables in their diet. We don't eat very much in the way of unrefined grains.
You want just thinking about the produce.
It'd be easier if you look at the. Did you pick up the pages? So go to page 2.
Yes.
The bottom of page 3. Yeah, so that's the section you're looking at there. And you see these two at the bottom, Bacteria and they change their one is those two at the bottom are the main butyrate producers. So when they're missing, they'll be more severe bowel problems because it'll get quite long without butyrate. And it's very obvious. Yeah. Butyrate also cools down your brain, which you can't, makes the liver cool down. It's really important, not just in the gut. Alrighty, so now let's just finish off this section about general ideas, and then I'll go into talking about charts. So the main idea is, as it's written there in the green, eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. That's about all the diet rules you need. This can be as simple as that. If you really, every time I'm talking with patients in my room, I've always got a reason to say you need more plant food because people don't have enough root veggies. That's a general rule. And if you juice your vegetables and fruits and throw away the fiber, you're missing the same quality. You're getting lots of nutrients, that's fine. You're getting it nice, quick and easy to absorb. But if you throw away the fiber, you're not feeding the good bacteria so much. Some of you may want to read a little. That one called Diet Myth. Can't see too well, it doesn't project very well, I'm sorry. But the Diet Myth by Tim Spector is a useful book, particularly for people who are trying to understand the relationship between whole foods and how they help you to lose weight. The more you eat refined foods, the more weight you gain. You can put people on the same calorie diets, but if they have a low fiber content in one of them, they'll be the people who get more obese from those calories. So fiber makes a big difference to weight management. All right, so what I'm going to do now, and I've talked about a lot of things already, but I'm just going to go on to why some people choose to do a stool test. And I'll just mention it. If you see those cards on top there, the green cards, for those of you coming to the talk, it gives you a discount if you do decide to do one of these tests. So I'll just go on to what they're about. The one that's the main report you can see in front of you looks at the DNA of 60 microbes. There's been a breakthrough in the last 10 years that you can look at the DNA of things fairly, not too expensive. And then that makes it much more accurate. The old methods of looking for what was in the poop wasn't very accurate. So we can find out a lot more from that DNA. And so the bacteria, the parasites, the worms, the yeasts and viruses can all be checked. Not many of the viruses, but the others we can get enough to know what's really going on. Because these tend to create the more severe digestive symptoms. So many of you feel better if you take some more fiber, but that's not always the answer. We often have to reduce the bacterial parasites or whatever to really get your gut health back. This test also measures your digestion. I'll go through it in page by page in a moment. Looks for inflammation, tells you whether you have a leaky gut, tells you whether you have a gluten intolerance. So quite a lot of information comes out of it. I'm going to just do, the one you have in your hand is what's on the screen. So it's easier to read those of you who have it in your hands to see the actual words more clearly, but I can give you the impressions from the screen. All of these bacteria here are not in detectable limits. So they say less than DL, less than detectable. So on the first page of those reports, these are the so-called pathogens. These are the things that are worst for you. So food poisoning, basically. And normally you would get some kind of diarrhea or something from those infections. So it's more severe. And mostly we see people coming, don't have very much. I probably only see one person in 10 have something on the first page. It's not that common that people come to us with that because it's more an acute problem and they might go and get an antibiotic because they've got severe diarrhea. On that list at the bottom here, and the one I've got on the board is Giardia. That's a parasite. Those three there are nasty parasites and usually have quite a lot of symptoms if you have those ones. The next page is the top of the page is Helicobacter pylori. Have any of you had that? Helicobacter pylori? It's pretty common. Actually, half of the group in the room here, let's say it's that half, have got Helicobacter. Half of that half, that many people, the Helicobacter is causing their health problems. So it's a really common thing. About 25% of people, according to what I'm finding with now, having done many hundreds of these, about 25% of my patients, the Helicobacter level is too high and it creates a chain of events that is causing their health problems. Now, Helicobacter lives in the stomach. So that's the first organ, like that's where it stops here. So most often there'll be some kind of symptoms there, but not always. So sometimes it's burping, sometimes it's pain, sometimes it's dyspepsia. Occasionally it's the bloating. Very often it's their skin problems. I mentioned acne rosacea. So this particular man, 44, one of the symptoms that he had, he actually came in to see me because of diarrhea, and Helicobacter doesn't cause diarrhea. So something else is going on. We'll see it as we go through the report. But he had many of the other symptoms, like some troubles up here, the skin problems that I mentioned. If Helicobacter is left for a long time, it causes stomach ulcers and even cancer. If you have stomach ulcers for years and years and years, you can develop stomach cancer from it. So it's a pretty important bug to get rid of if it's showing up too high like this one. And this is just a mention of Helicobacter causing many, many types of symptoms. You can see lots of names there that you don't want. So even psoriasis for those of you, vitiligo, it's a stomach, it's a loss of skin color. So many types of things caused by this Helicobacter infection. Now, this is the bottom part of page 2. This is more to do with the good bacteria levels. These are not necessarily harmful unless they're super high. So, yeah, it's the same important. So what do we see here? Instead of the last, the one I showed you earlier where they had a lack of a lot of these bacteria, this one's got a ton of them. And when we see that there's generally an overgrowth of bacteria in the bowel, it means that there's too much food reaching the bowel. Why would there be? Because food will feed them, so there's too many of them. Why would that happen? That happens because the digestion is being affected. In this case, the stomach gets ruined by Helicobacter pylori. So Helicobacter pylori takes out the acid from the stomach, and then the food doesn't get digested, and so there's more food goes down, and the bacteria thrive on that. So what the patient will have is a bacterial overgrowth in their gut. What it looks like on the next slide is like this. So there's several bacteria overgrowth. This one's probably the one that's causing his diarrhea. But essentially, because the stomach's not doing its job owing to the Helicobacter, then there's a bacterial overgrowth that also needs treatment. So first we're going to treat his Helicobacter, then we're going to treat this bacterial overgrowth. He didn't have any parasites and worms. It's always reassuring. Everybody always has a sigh of relief when they see this page. Oh, I don't have any parasites. That's great. So, but about 20% of people do have something there. Here's the last part of the report, and it's more about digestion. So this fellow, his elastase is not so good. That means his pancreas is weak. That's another reason that he's got too much food going down his gut, because he's not digesting his food terribly well. That's been caused by the Helicobacter. The immunity, the next one that's got a circle on it, the secretory IgA, that's about his immunity. It's too weak. Well, it's part of why he has too many bacteria in his gut too. And the last one is called zonulin. That's a measure of whether you have a leaky gut. Now, Helicobacter will cause ulcers, which is a leaky gut. So the bacterial overgrowth in general tends to push that really high. Okay, so we find out a lot. Basically, why I've shown you a report is just to give you an idea of this big picture. Once I understand it, then I know what to do, which is obviously important. So there's a sequence of things. I have to get rid of the Helicobacter first. It won't, nothing will get better until the stomach's working better. It's kind of the king of the digestive system. Then we go after the bacterial overgrowth. And finally, we have to repair his leaky gut. And as we repair his leaky gut, his skin will get better. So he's just at the stage of getting the first couple of treatments, and he's resolving his diarrhea at the moment with that. But his skin yet hasn't cleared up. Usually with eczema, psoriasis, things like that, it's when you heal the leaky gut that the skin gets better. Because while there's gunk coming through into the blood, it finds its way through the liver, it goes through the lymph and ends up affecting the skin very often. So I'll just very quickly point to, you can measure whether you have SIBO. It's a breath test. I think it's the last page on your notes. Be easy to see on your notes, but basically every 20 minutes you breathe into a tube after drinking some kind of liquid that if you have too many bacteria, the bacteria make gas from the liquid, hydrogen, and in some cases methane. And when those gases are too high, it proves that you have a bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine. So you could say you have SIBO. And so then the treatment, or maybe their IBS, would be for the SIBO. So this is the way we prove you have SIBO. The other test with the first one, it doesn't say where the bacteria are. It just says you have them in the poop. Whereas this says the bacteria in the small intestine. So that's a diagnosis. And it's really handy for people with IBS, because instead of like missing the diagnosis, what's really going on, calling it IBS, it's called SIBO, and it's a different treatment because you're working with bacteria and you use antimicrobial herbs or even antibiotics for it, and that resolves IBS. So that's the main part of what I wanted to say for you today. I don't think I need to point out other ones of those. So there's a ton of kinds of symptoms that can resolve once you get the gut healthy. There's a list of them, tons of things. Basically, most chronic diseases will get better when we improve the gut health. Because you get rid of the inflammation, get rid of the toxins, it always makes a difference. So that's why I'm so interested in it, because people always come in looking for the cause of their problems. And very often getting the microbiome, that and stress, probably the two biggest single factors in why people get sick. So, I can help them a lot with the gut. Hopefully they get their stress side of life worked out too. And normally things are resolved really well with those two approaches. All right, that's what I want to say. If any of you wanted to let Helen near the door know that you'd like us to call you to make a time for any of these appointments, happy to help you and give you the discount. But have we got any questions? Yeah.
Question. I don't know if you covered this already. What's the difference between pre and probiotics?
Yeah. Okay. We need postbiotics now. So I've done with the last one first. Postbiotics are things like the butyrate, the stuff that the bacteria make. So it's post. The prebiotics are things that feed the bacteria. So there are certain foods, and you can extract the goodies from those foods that are able to feed bacteria. So onions and garlic, for instance, asparagus, chicory root. These are all foods that have a lot of substances in them that feed the bacteria. For some people, that makes them gassy. So that's something some people have to be careful with. But when you're feeding the bacteria, generally that's good. So you want to have those kind of foods in your diet. You can now get powders of prebiotics. But mostly I'm suggesting people get the high fiber diet going on who does that. But occasionally there was one of these slides I showed you a few back. A case like this one here, where they're basically missing so much, I will give them a prebiotic powder to get it going. Just to help get them built up. So, and then of course the probiotics, there's 3 different types. There's yeast ones called Saccharomyces boulardii. They're really good for diarrhea. They help the immunity of your gut. Then there's the Lactobacillus bifidus, which is the major part of the market. And, they help with things like IBS and just help your digestion, help your immunity. They're the most general ones we use. And then there's another group that are actually quite important called spore-based probiotics. They're made from bacillus spores. Are kind of, sometimes they're called soil-based organisms. They come from the dirt, but they're special species that you select from those. And they are quite anti-inflammatory, tend to help with constipation and never cause any bloating, which some probiotics do for some people. So it's quite a good one if you're looking for, a safe probiotic that won't upset the tummy. Yeah. Right.
This series. What is the name of the probiotic you recommend for protein absorption?
Yeah, that's the
Do you
four.
take it? Do we sell it at IMI?
Yeah, so there's two strengths we have here at IMI, but each of them have the name spore in them. So it's one of these spore-based probiotics. There's one called ProbioSpore, that's more of an adult dose. And there's another one by the Clear Labs people, and that's easily given to children. They can be opened up into food. And spore-based probiotics are quite effective. They are also used for cases where they've got a leaky gut. Quite good for that. Yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, one last question, Greg. What is the mechanism by which stress certain negatively impacts the gut microbiome?
There's two or three different ones. So your nervous system directly, because there is a top-down effect with the nervous system. If it's high stress, then you start to get into the cortisol, and the cortisol affects the inflammatory and immune processes. Both of those together tend to reduce the secretions of the digestive organs. And then the sort of ongoing stage of that is things start to move to exhaustion. It's just kind of like the next stage of stress when everything gets weak and tired. Loss of sleep is the major thing. People often say, I'm not very stressed, I'm just busy. But the main sign of being really stressed is you're having broken sleep. Either you can't fall asleep or you wake up at 3 or 5 and can't get back to sleep. Basically, at that point, you're getting down beyond the stress. Anybody else? Okay, I know there was too much here, but there's simple points. If you've got a more serious digestive problem, it's probably best to get it tested, then you'll get a good treatment. If you have had it for years and years and years and haven't figured it out, again, better to come and get some expert advice. But if you've just got mild things and you just want to improve your digestive health, just work on the amount of plant food you have. And if you don't jump too fast, sometimes people go from none to tons and all of a sudden they've got lots of gas and bloating. It would settle if they keep going, but most people get put off by that. So, you don't have to jump from one serve to 30 different plant foods a week, but go on slowly and get it up to 30 different plant foods a week. It's a nice challenge. It's a bit like doing I've got to do 10,000 steps or I've got to get 7 or 8 hours sleep. It's like, I've got to get 30 different plant foods a week. It's one of those good health rules. If you do those 3 things, you're probably going to be pretty healthy. So